Our goal with CMC Connects is to do 2 relevant and or fun programs every month during the academic semester. We're so thrilled to have Professor Zach Corser, who's co-director of our policy lab, and of course, a professor of government at CMC, talking to us today about the midterm elections. We have 57 minutes, a lot of ground to cover, and I'm sure a lot of questions. So Zach, I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to turn it over to you with a big thanks from the alumni and parent and advancement teams at CMC. Thanks for all you do for the college. And for those of you that don't know, most importantly, Zach is an alumnus of CMC. Professor Corser, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Evan, for the invite, and Josh for helping to organize this. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for taking time out of your busy day to come talk about the midterms. I know you're all CMCers, so you've all been following the news like mental patients about what's going to happen here in November. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to try to cover things in a broad perspective, but also in the limited amount of time, maybe identify a few races and a few thoughts to give you as we head into really the final lap for the 2022 midterm elections. So with that, let me share my screen and put up a PowerPoint. So let's evaluate the 2022 midterms. It's been a tumultuous couple of years since our last election. Things have changed and things haven't changed. That's sort of how politics works. And we're going to talk about factors that are particular to this election, factors that are particular to really every midterm election, and then try to do some evaluation, not necessarily to predict and take out our crystal balls and say exactly what the picture is going to be in November, but rather to at least try to understand the dynamics of our politics right now and how they're influencing voters and how it's likely to influence not only the coming congressional session, but of course, 2024 and the rematch between two previous contenders or maybe 2 new names we haven't even thought of yet. So if you haven't heard of the Policy Lab, I encourage you to check us out. It's policylab.cmc.edu. I co-direct it with Professor Eric Helland in the economics department, and we do a variety of different projects with think tanks in Washington and other sorts of governmental entities. We involve our students in top flight academic policy research. And we also teach a course called the Policy Lab. That's the capstone for the new public policy major here at Claremont, McKenna. So, we like to think of it as in the tradition of CMC, including students in real world research. And we think it's a tremendous way for CMC to approach policy. So again, if you're interested, check us out. But let's get into the midterms. So one of the things that you might know, maybe from your Gov 20 class or just by being a regular newspaper reader, is that midterms don't attract the same level of attention and therefore turnout as do presidential elections. You're pretty much guaranteed a plus 50% turnout during a presidential year. In a blowout year, we might see north of 60% turnout. But midterms, they're not as interesting. They tend to attract less than 50%. In fact, if you can see on this graph here, in the last 100 or so years, we're looking around an average of about 40, maybe 42% turnout for midterms. So what does that mean? Well, it means that midterms are more sensitive to turnout in general. That means motivation, people feeling motivated to turn up to a midterm election really affects the outcome. It really has to do also with we're talking about motivation, about the in party and the out party in terms of who's president. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But people who are partisans of the president's party tend to be less motivated to go to the polls. And those who are in the out party tend to be more motivated. They want to get their voice heard. They're maybe still thinking about the last presidential election, and they want to get their voice heard and try to advantage their side in the elections. So it's not just a matter of getting everyone to turn up. It really is more sensitive to turnout. So what about this particular election in 2022? What ought we to expect? Well, if you remember back to 2018, we actually had the highest turnout in a midterm election in 104 years. So there's a new standard being set since 2020 and since 2018 for turnout. Republicans and Democrats are extremely divided and extremely keen to win back Congress and the presidency. And so I think we're likely to see a similarly high turnout in the 2022 election. What does that mean? Well, I think it doesn't necessarily, I think it means one thing. One is that an old saw says that in a lower turnout election, Republicans tend to be more advantaged. I don't know that that's always been true. It's kind of an old saw that we come up with during the midterms, but I don't know that just on the basis of turnout that we can make a lot of predictions about who's necessarily going to win. But I do think it's going to be a very high turnout election, and that's going to make it different than what's come in the past. One thing that I think will definitely play into this election is presidential approval. So it's a kind of dictum in congressional midterm elections. It has been for a century or more that the midterm election tends to be a referendum on the performance of the incumbent president. And an incumbent president has to be pretty popular to fight through a lot of headwinds that he faces with an electorate who may not be very satisfied with the performance, particularly if the chips are down in terms of issues, in terms of indicators like inflation. We'll talk about that later. If a president isn't fairly popular going into a midterm election, chances are that his party is destined to lose seats in the upcoming midterm. So what is the situation with President Biden and the Democrats going into the 2022 election? Well, as you can see from this chart here, this is from 538. Biden crossed the Rubicon of a net positive way back in August of last year. And he's been as low as the mid 30s or high 30s in terms of approval. And that really spells disaster for midterms and for his incumbent party. Now, the good news, if there is any, for Democrats coming into the 2022 election, at least looking at history, is that Biden has had a surprising, unexpected uptick in approval ratings that started in mid-June. And this really kind of got Democrats out of their doldrums. Democrats, I think, were, for them, in terms of voters, in terms of candidates, in terms of fundraising, I think Democrats, they know all this. They know that the deck is sort of, the chips are down and the deck is stacked against them this time around. And so they were looking at Biden's approval numbers and thinking, wow, this is going to be a blowout come November. But then we had this uptick in Biden's approval rating. And then, of course, because, the agenda gets set by what happens in the media and what happens in the country, there's maybe some unexpected things that came out that helped to aid Biden in his sort of slow recovery, not to big numbers. We're not talking telephone numbers in terms of his approval rating, but at least we're talking not in the 30s. Maybe he's headed to the mid 40s or so. One factor, of course, was the Dobbs decision. Basically the Supreme Court modifying and eliminating a federal protection in the Constitution for abortion rights. And this had an unexpected effect on Democrats in terms of getting them much more engaged in this election than they were. It gave them a sort of a rallying point for them to have a reason to show up, not to be disappointed, not to be disaffected, not to be complacent, but rather to feel like there's an issue at stake here and that they wanted to affect the election and that the midterms were extremely important in terms of possible future nominees to the Supreme Court, to the federal courts, but of course, in terms of policies that Congress might make relating to abortion. So abortion has become an incredibly salient issue. Before June, people were anxious and maybe anticipating something, but probably not the the repeal of Roe versus Wade. And so this has been a kind of surprising feature. I don't know that it directly correlates to the popularity of Biden, but I do think it has a lot to do with sort of a general appeal of Democrats being more engaged going into the election. And I just picked this one act in particular, the Inflation Reduction Act that was signed in August. There'd been a long period of time where Biden came into office with some pretty high expectations that frankly he built for himself in a lot of ways. Commentators started to look at his agenda and think to themselves, is Biden proposing a new deal? Does he really see his majorities in Congress and his mandate coming into office as really authorizing kind of a big scale change to American policy? And so there was a lot of missteps at first, particularly when it came to a very close 50-50 Senate. Joe Manchin became a headline figure, as did Kristen Sinema. in terms of, whether or not Biden could get any kind of package through that could really modify policy to do the sort of things that Biden thought he needed to do to reassure Americans that the federal government was still capable, that Congress and the presidency could deliver policy change, and that politics wasn't just about disappointment at the federal government. It wasn't about a loss of legitimacy of representation. The stakes were very high. Well, recently, Biden has had some legislative wins going into the end of the year. He, of course, had success with a transportation bill earlier in the year, but he's also had success with this big Inflation Reduction Act. And I think, generally speaking, the feeling that Biden was sort of getting things done, I think really did aid his approval rating, despite, a lot of negatives that we'll talk about in a minute going into the midterm election. So we went from something that I think was probably, a four-alarm fire disaster into something that just looks really tough. This is not, for those of you who took a statistics course, this is correlation, not causation, but I think this will give you some understanding of the relationship between how many seats a party is going to gain or lose. The president's party is going to gain or lose going into a midterm election, depending on the president's approval rating. So this is a scatter plot of the two things: the party's seat gain in the House and in the Senate, and the president's approval rating as a scatter plot with a trend line. Biden right now, as we just saw, is about at 44%. So again, this is not correlation, but just sort of looking at this clumsy scatter plot, we can see that if Biden performed and the Congress performed within the trend that we've observed, we could probably anticipate he would lose about 5 seats in the Senate and about 35 seats in the House. Now, this is not a model. This is not a regression. This is just a correlation. It's less correlated on the Senate side. The R equals 0.45. It's not a very high correlation. It's a little higher in the House. But it's just sort of give you an idea of like, what does it look like for Biden if all things being equal, not really sort of creating a model about 2022 or comparing it in any sophisticated way. But again, just trying to see what is the relation? How does this correlate to his approval rating? Again, it just doesn't look good. It looks like pretty bad, generally speaking, for both the House and the Senate. And you can see like what tough sledding it is for a president, even if a president was popular. Like, let's say Biden, was pulling numbers of 60, 65%. If you look in the upper right quadrant of both charts, you can see that there are very few races where even popular presidents were able to pull out wins in terms of gaining seats in the Senate or the House. You can see this has happened more often on the Senate side, and you can see that the dispersion and the lack of correlation on the Senate side really tells you something in terms of how linked presidential politics are to the Senate. There's a lot more factors going on in Senate elections that are unique to Senate races, that are unique to what's happening in a particular state. It's a larger kind of election that takes in more issues that are germane to the state and not necessarily overwhelmed by what's happening in the nation or what's going on with the president. So that's why I think you see more of a dispersion on that side. And while sometimes when it comes to the Senate, despite a president being relatively unpopular, they still might pick up a few seats. There's also other things about the Senate, of course. Only a third of the Senate is up for election every 2 years. So it really does depend on the mix of Senate seats that are actually up for re-election in that particular year. On the House side, it really does heave much closer to presidential politics and national politics. There may be outliers in terms of certain races, but by and large, the House is much more correlated to what's happening with the president. So what are some key factors in the 2022 midterms? Well, obviously, top line, the 40-year high inflation. Now, I don't know, for those of you thinking Econ 50 or getting into the economics of this, I don't know that Democrats and Republicans are necessarily pointing fingers on who's responsible. I think it just really does boil down to, who's in office when this happens. There's an argument maybe to be had about the Fed and about Democrats and Biden not seeing inflation as a problem, calling it transitory, not getting to work on trying to take measures to try to reduce it before it got out of hand, and certainly, before it got to a 40-year high. But by and large, in terms of thinking about the election as a whole, I think Americans see what's happening with fuel prices. They see what's happening with food prices. They see what's happening with the mortgage market and interest rates. And they're just liable to blame Biden and the incumbents for these problems. And I don't know that Democrats have a lot to gainsay that. It's really made Republicans' jobs a little easier in the sense that they can simply say, don't you think we could do better than this? We're the alternative. Don't you want to try something else? Don't you want to trust us again on the economy? They don't have to go quite as deep into the issue because they, at least in the perception of voters, they're not the ones to blame. There's a real sort of recency bias in the way that people are thinking about inflation. So this is an enormous headwind. I think I just already mentioned before the Dobbs decision. I think it's open right now in terms of how much this is going to affect turnout. I think it's going to be a much higher turnout race in general. Dobbs may actually add on top of that. We may see a higher turnout than in 2018. The question is, will it actually advantage Democrats? Will this lead to a turnout advantage for Democrats? Now, there was something tantalizing that happened over the summer. Kansas sent out a referendum to voters, basically asking them to repeal a constitutional protection for abortion. And to the shock and surprise of a lot of voters, this happened a couple of months actually after the Dobbs decision, Kansas actually voted 59% not to repeal this constitutional amendment. Now, you wouldn't think of Kansas as being a very red state, or sorry, a very blue state, or being very much in support of abortion rights, and yet they voted to affirm abortion rights just after the Dobbs decision. Now, what's the half-life on that? There are things particular to the Kansas race in terms of how the question was posed to voters, in terms of their history of having a constitutional protection. It's hard to generalize this throughout the country, but I think there's also a question of, have people kind of wandered away from this issue? Is it as gripping as it was just after it happened in June? Will it have the same kind of energy and impulse in November as it had in June, July, and August of this year? I think that remains to be seen. But there's obviously still a lot of energy, fundraising, and interest among Democratic voters thanks to the Dobbs decision. Another factor is Trump's influence on GOP candidate selection. So, this is not just to do with Congress. This is to do with state legislatures, with statewide office, with governors, but very much with Senate and House races as well. Donald Trump has been very active since he left office, particularly talking about how he thinks, the 2020 election was fraudulent. And it's become a litmus test for whether or not you're truly with Trump and sort of his MAGA point of view on Republican politics, whether or not you endorse that perspective. And a lot of candidates have decided to endorse that perspective out of fear, I think, of crossing Donald Trump and not having his support and not having his supporters behind them, particularly in primary races, or that they actually believe him and they think that the 2020 election was stolen and they're true believers and that's why they're running for office. But Trump has had his hands in a lot of different races. I don't think you would have seen Dr. Oz running in Pennsylvania, for example, if Trump hadn't gotten involved. I think there's a lot of questioning across the board about candidate quality. Did Trump disadvantage Republicans in some key races around the country because he threw support behind weaker candidates? Again, that sort of remains to be seen. But as going into 2024, this will be, people are going to be reading the tea leaves here. Whose party is it? I think there's been a period of time since the 2020 election where we've seen other Republicans come into national view, particularly the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, as being a possible alternative to Trump as a nominee for president in 2024. Trump may not have the dominance that he did, and certainly he's had a lot of hits this year in terms of legal troubles, both in his business life and, of course, his post-presidential life. He's fighting on a lot of different fronts, and it's not as obvious that it's his party lock, stock, and barrel. So, seeing what the results are in this November, if his candidates end up winning, if he becomes associated with keeping Republicans going and advantaging them, I think this is going to be this is going to be an even bigger shift in his direction, both in terms of how Congress organizes, how Republicans in Congress organize themselves, and I think also in advantaging Trump going into 2024. So this is something to watch. He's around, he's a part of the mix. Crime. So crime statistics have been edging up. Violent crime was up 4.6% in the first half of 2022. But I think just generally speaking, Republicans, particularly going into the final lap of the 2022 elections in several key races, have really been successful at both making the issue of crime very salient on voters' minds and linking the Democratic Party to defund the police, to ideas that, somehow Democrats are not hard on crime, that Republicans need to step in some way to change current policies because Democrats can't be trusted to keep the streets safe. There's a lot of things to be said about the merits of those arguments, but I'll say in terms of voters, I think voters have been receptive to these ideas in certain key races, and Republicans are trying to play it to the hilt as much as they can. And so I think this has been another headwind for Democrats, particularly among suburban voters, this issue of rising crime and a perception that Democrats are weak on the issue. War in Ukraine. So maybe this is a last lap issue. Frankly, I don't know that this issue has had as much of an impact as I think it should, frankly, on the midterm elections. It's really domestic concerns and inflation, even though inflation itself is very much affected by the war in Ukraine and what's happening in Russia in terms of energy prices and other key indicators that affect America's economic future. But the argument is not being made in quite that way. Either by candidates or by the Biden administration. So the war in Ukraine, it's a factor. I think you're starting to hear as we head towards the election, some concerns that maybe Republicans are soft on supporting Ukraine, there's some Republicans elected or people who are running for office right now who are saying that they would be less likely to fund the war effort in Ukraine. Can that be made into an issue? Will voters actually care? Frankly, I think probably not. But this may presage some division, depending on the outcomes in the election going to 2024, over Ukraine, where it won't be necessarily as unified as a position as it has been in the past. The lion that didn't roar, I think, is redistricting. I think there was a lot of energy about the 2020 census and how that was going to affect redistricting. There were a lot of battles in a lot of states. We don't have time to get into the details of all of that, but I can tell you that net, it looks like Democrats came ahead by about 6 seats. So they did advantage themselves, not tremendously, but on balance, they did a little bit better. But given all the other factors, given all these different headwinds, given candidate selection, given retirements. I mean, there's another thing about open seats in the House of Representatives and the number of Democrats that were in probably safe seats had they decided to remain in Congress who retired, exposing them more to challengers in an open seat, because it's always easier to win an open seat than try to beat an incumbent. So Democrats came more exposed in different ways, and redistricting couldn't save that. Even though on net, Democrats came out slightly ahead. So, 538 has changed the way that we've talked about elections a little bit in terms of talking about probabilities. They come up with their own turnout models that are based on a particular election. They try to see what the probabilities are based on their model and the data of where candidates are, to see what the likely outcomes are. So I don't want to dwell a lot on this, but for those of you who follow 538 or are curious about it, you can go to their website and sort of look at their model. What does it contain? Look at various races to try to get a better perspective on what's influencing these races from a statistical standpoint. But just to show you overall, statistically speaking, Senate's pretty close, 50-50 really, can go either way overall in terms of their model and their simulations. But you can see on the House side, if you remember the scatter plot, if you talk about the issues we just talked about, it's maybe unsurprising that it looks like Republicans are much more likely to take a majority. But let's break that apart a little bit more to try to understand how these races are stacking up and what it is that Republicans and Democrats actually have to accomplish to win the majority in either chamber. So the Cook Political Report, you might know them. Charlie Cook, well-known figure in Washington, D.C. for punditry. In fact, David Wasserman, who does House elections, a former student of mine, and they go and rate all of the different elections according to the likelihood of Republicans or Democrats keeping a seat, or whether it's just total toss-up. Just can't tell. Who knows? And it's a way to sort of get an overall picture of how each party is competing with one another and where the seats sort of line up. And you can see already, just sort of looking at the columns here, in the center, we have Democratic toss-ups and Republican toss-ups. And it goes out from the center, lean Republican and lean Democrat, and then likely Democrat and likely Republican. We can see already that Democrats have a lot more toss-ups and they have a lot more to defend. Of the current seats that they hold, that Democrats hold and that are part of their majority, they've got 21 toss-ups, whereas Republicans only have 10. So right off the bat, Democrats are more exposed in the House going into the 2022 election. If we add all of these toss-ups together and just sort of assume we can't know either side will win, in order for the Dems to win a majority, they'd actually have to win 81% of these open seats in order to keep the majority. That's a pretty high bar to reach. And talking about all the headwinds that we've talked about, from presidential popularity to inflation to a lot of different factors, it really doesn't look like the conditions are right for Democrats to overperform in quite that way. Republicans only have to win 7 of these toss-ups to take the majority. So only about a third of the open seats. So, just on the surface, it's an easier sled for the Republicans than the Democrats in the House of Representatives. In the Senate, both parties are defending 2 toss-up seats, according to the Cook Political Report. And then there's a handful of more what Cook considers lean Democrats and lean Republican districts, meaning that these are states that are leaning towards a particular party but aren't firmly in their grasp. So you can consider them competitive seats. And these are seats that we've been talking about all year long and before. Those are Gabriel Warnock in Georgia, Cortez Masto in Nevada, in Pennsylvania, the open seat, and in Wisconsin, Ron Johnson. And then there's also some competitive races that are happening that are considered lean. Kelly, first-term senator in Arizona, and then also the race in Ohio to replace Rob Portman, where J.D. Vance and Tim Ryan are competing, and that race has gotten a lot of attention. We'll talk a little bit more about both of those races. So all of these races, from the lean D to the lean R, are still pretty tight heading into the election. So while the House looks pretty certain to shift majorities to the Republicans, it's still really up in the air about Democrats. Who knows? It's really going to depend on the final lap. So let's take a look at some of these races that are considered toss-up or lean D or R going into the final lap. So I've included the Cook rating from the last page, and then also the percentage lead in terms of the average of averages of polls that are compiled by Real Clear Politics. You policy people and political wonks out there will probably likely go to Real Clear Politics pretty often to try to, put your finger in the air and sort of see which way the wind's blowing on all these different races. So the closest race to America right now is Adam Laxalt and Cortez Masto in Nevada. It's within the margin of error right now. It's still a toss-up. I can tell you it's really competitive there. I was in Nevada recently and I watched the evening news, and evening news is usually filled with medical commercials, for some kind of prescription drug, maybe a car commercial. It was wall-to-wall ads for politics. The governor's race, which is also highly competitive there, the Senate race, they've got just a ton of really competitive races that really look like they could go either way. So I don't know what to tell you about Nevada going into the election, but it looks really close. Fetterman, There's a lot of issues there that you're all familiar with, I'm sure. The fact that Fetterman had a stroke, and there's been some questions about his ability to serve in the Senate and just his health in general. He was very reluctant to enter into a debate, but finally agreed. He's kind of owned his opposition, I think, for the most part, at least if you look at it from a social media point of view. Dr. Oz, Mehmet Oz, has had, I think, a really tough time sort of getting one over on Fetterman, particularly because he comes from New Jersey. Seems like he's just transplanted himself for purposes of running for the Senate. And he's also got some other problems in terms of seeming a bit distant from the people, the sort of crudité scandal where, he looks like a guy who owns a lot of homes, is very wealthy, is very distant, is not even a Pennsylvanian. Despite being endorsed by Trump, it's really been tough for Oz to get ahead. So I think Fetterman's still pretty strong going into the final lap. We'll talk about each of these races a little bit more. We'll talk about Fetterman and Warnock a bit more after this. So I'll talk about Warnock in a minute. Kelly looks strong going into the final lap. I think that it's correctly rated at lean D here. I think it's looking pretty good for him. But in Ohio, lean R, Vance, JD Vance, and Tim Ryan. That's going to be one to watch. It's close. It's advanced. I think Vance definitely has the lead, but I think Tim Ryan has distinguished himself among Democrats for trying to find a kind of tone that really works in states like Ohio, a sort of working class, everyman, moderate Democrat, not as easily linked to a lot of criticisms that Democrats try to put on Democrats about, being overly progressive or being beholden to progressive forces within the Democratic Party. I think Tim Ryan's done about as good a job as anybody at trying to demonstrate to Ohioans that, he's a moderate Democrat and worthy of their vote. So even though I think the advantage is for Vance in that state, it's still, I think, going to be an uphill climb for Tim Ryan. Johnson, I think, is probably the biggest surprise. I think, and I would, if I was Cook, I would rank Wisconsin, not toss up, but lean R at this point. I think there's been some disappointments with the Lieutenant Governor Barnes in Wisconsin that since this summer, they've kind of reversed positions. Barnes was way ahead. There's a kind of fatigue with Johnson as being too radical, too much a Trumper, too MAGA, that Wisconsinites were getting tired of him and his antics. But I think Barnes has had a real problem closing the deal. And I think the issue of crime has really impacted that race. And we'll look at some of the averages going forward here. So don't believe the generic congressional vote. It doesn't really mean much. I think it's more of just kind of a litmus test for, generically speaking, where's America right now in terms of thinking about the parties and thinking about their vote for Congress. It doesn't mean this is the way they're going to vote, but I do think it's a kind of perception. And for those of you who like Glenn, know the movie Glengarry Glen Ross, coffee's for closers, right? And so who's going to win this race? It's going to be the party and the candidates that close well in the remaining weeks of this campaign. Ballots are already out in a lot of states. Nevada, for example, they're like California, like a lot of other states since 2020 and before, who mail everyone a ballot. And so a lot of people already have ballots, waiting for them at home or have sent them in already. So the race is on, and closing has started. We're closing up here, folks. And in the final lap, Republicans have leapt ahead. When I was talking earlier about Biden's popularity around August and September and going towards October, you could see that I think there was an effect there where Democrats were doing well. Republicans as a generic choice were starting to shrink. But by October, this is divided, and then heading into mid to late October, Republicans are really surging ahead by a couple of points, and it's making a difference in a lot of tight races. So, who's closing well? Looks like Republicans are closing well. Like, for instance, looking at the Ohio Senate, despite the fact that I think Ryan has done a good job portraying himself as a moderate Republican, he's never really quite managed to break Vance and Vance's lead in the state. Ohio used to be something of a bellwether, and I think it's definitely more in the Republican category. So it was going to be harder for Ryan in general, but it looks like in the last few days here, last few weeks, Vance is starting to pull away. Of course, several candidates, including these two, have had debates. They don't seem to have had a strong effect in terms of like reshaping the election. I don't think it had strong. This particular debate had a strong effect on reshaping the dynamics of the Vance-Ryan race in Ohio. So it's looking like Vance is pulling away. Look, he might actually close in Ohio. In Wisconsin, as I was saying, Barnes was doing pretty well not too long ago. If we go back to August, Barnes was on top and Johnson really looked like he was in trouble. But since September, Barnes has really dropped. Johnson has really made the crime issue much more salient in Wisconsin. And despite the fact that I think people are tired of Johnson, I think they're having trouble trusting Barnes that he's going to be tough on crime or that he really fits what Wisconsin wants to see in the US Senate. So unfortunately, it looks like for Democrats, it looks like despite the money and the effort and the hopes, it looks like the incumbent is pulling away in Wisconsin. Nevada, like I said, very close, but Cortez Masto actually has since September dropped, and Adam Laxalt has actually gone up in the polls. It's still too close to call. I won't call that one, but I'll just say that the advantage in the polls at least seems to be going to Adam Laxalt. Last one I'll talk about is the Georgia Senate, which has really taken up a lot of the national headlines. They had a couple of one recent debate and another debate with a podium. That's another story. But there was a recent debate and a lot of things about, Walker's fact, that he paid for an abortion, what is his true position. There's been a lot of bad news coming out for Warnock for Walker. And going into the closing lap here, as you can see, it really looked like he was tanking and that things were clarifying in that race. Well, again, unfortunately for Democrats, it looks like Warnock, is starting to recede a bit, and that Walker's coming up. It looks like, his involvement in that debate actually advantaged him in some ways, I think by clearing the air about his abilities and by basically meeting low expectations that he set himself for his performance in that particular debate. And I think there's a lot of national factors affecting the votes of Georgians in this particular race. So, who knows? But there's a third candidate, a libertarian candidate who's also running. So there's actually a chance, and I don't want to give anyone, I'm going to trigger alert here for those of you who lived through the 2020 election. There actually might be a chance of a runoff. If Walker isn't able to actually win outright, but somehow holds Warnock below 50%, because a lot of Republicans who couldn't say hold their nose and vote for Walker because of his positions and actions on abortion and other ideas, might sit it out, but they might also vote for the third party libertarian candidate. And so there's a chance that we may not know who the majority is going to be in the US Senate until after December 6th. We could go into overtime yet again. So just to warn you all about that. But one nice thing is Georgia moved up the runoff election. It won't be in January. It's going to be a month after the November election. So we won't have quite as long to go into it. But I think if we looked at a runoff election, I think even more than now, Georgians would likely be thinking about this as who do we want to give control of the Senate to, rather than who do we want to represent Georgia, particularly if this seat ends up determining the majority, which it may very well do. So with that, I'm going to stop. I think I met my mark pretty well in taking 40 minutes and open this up to questions from the audience. So thanks so much for your attention. I hope you found that interesting. And I look forward to your own insights and thoughts on this race.
Thanks, Zach. If you have a question, feel free to raise your hand in the reaction section. You can address Professor Corso directly. You can also put a question in the chat, either publicly or privately to me, and I'm happy to ask the question on your behalf.
I mean,
I'll kick it off, Zach.
You shy? Come on now.
CMCers, they don't really ask good questions anymore. They just, no, I'm kidding. Ooh. The challenge is on. Zach, what do you actually think will happen? Put on
Well,
your,
I think
your
it's
hat.
hard to say anything looking at what I've just presented there to say that, it would take a miracle for Democrats to hold on to the House. I think Republicans are going to take the House. I think the big question is what are the dynamics that are going to play out in caucus politics in terms of rule changes, in terms of the influence of the Freedom Caucus, in terms of maybe successful candidates that were endorsed by Trump who want to make a mark moving into the 2023 session of Congress. I don't know that, Kevin McCarthy seems like a likely candidate right now to be Speaker of the House, but I think it's not a foregone conclusion. He could end up finding the dynamics changed somewhat, that a lot of people don't see him as, they might see him as a minority leader, but they might not see him as a speaker. Steve Scalise might be an alternative to him. I think it really just it's sort of a question of, how the caucus feels and how big a majority they get and how much Kevin can try to claim that as his own doing, that he can take some ownership over the success of Republicans heading into 2023. So I don't really know what shape this majority is going to look like in the House of Representatives. I think that's still open and still an open question. I think the Republicans are sort of in a transitory period here between sort of what came before and what's going to come after. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens in the House when that's likely to happen. That is to say, they get the majority. On the Senate side, find a coin and flip it. I think there's a lot of ways in which, scenarios rather, that Republicans, make a seat, that make it ahead by a seat, that Democrats make it 50-50 and control the chamber, thanks to holding the presidency and continuing to sort of hold this narrow, functioning one vote majority in the Senate. But, I couldn't tell you. I think, being a political observer the last few years, I think the likely scenario is that, yes, we're going to have a runoff in Georgia. And yes, it will determine who runs the Senate. I think it's just going to be like that. That's my feeling.
Thank you. John McDowell, go ahead and unmute. There, I just asked you to unmute. Go ahead.
There we go. Okay, great. Thanks, Evan. So for the last several years, at least since the 2020 election, the Republican Party really hasn't had any kind of platform or any kind of policy proposals. There is this commitment to America that Kevin McCarthy is touting, but that seems to be vaporware. So I think that, so my question is, if they do take control of the House, which I think, of course, is likely, and the Senate, what would you expect them to actually try to put forth as policy? In actual concrete terms, particularly when it looks like some of their leaders, they're being really pushed hard from sort of the Taylor Greens and the Boberts in the House, and even the Ron Johnsons in the Senate. They seem to be pushing towards something that probably a big chunk of Americans, at least a majority, probably don't agree with.
It's a really good question, John. And I think the answer is you're going to see more pressure on what used to be kind of fundamental parts of a Republican platform put under pressure yet again, somewhat like they were during the Trump years, but I think in a much stronger way, because I think if a lot of Trump endorsed candidates who have a sort of MAGA perspective going in, you're going to see a more performative kind of behavior in a lot of these candidates, where they may not be quite as acutely focused on accomplishing policy ends, but more in sort of looking the part in terms of the way they communicate, in terms of attacking the left and the Democrats, in terms of trying to draw attention to themselves through outrageous comments and provocative statements, things that we've seen from Trump, things that we see from Marge Green and Boebert. I think you'll see more of that. And then on actual issues, I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on immigration again. Even though Trump is not president, I think you're going to hear more demands about the immigration issue. We've seen this kind of bubbling to the surface from governors this past year by the stunts we've seen, in terms of flying immigrants to Martha's Vineyard, or this sort of continual busing that's going on from border states to New York City, where red border states and Republican governors are basically trying to shift the problem and focus attention on what's happening at the border. And I think, Republicans who it seems like it's been a while, it's been a minute now, but at least, going back, 20, 30, 40 years, have been the more pro-immigration party. And I think Republicans are going to be much harsher about immigration. And I think expectations are going to go way up in terms of policy. I think in another dimension, and I kind of hinted at this too, is foreign relations. While I don't think this is on a lot of people's minds going into the ballot box this November, I think there's some real potential here for Republicans to actually, be more, for lack of a better word, isolationist, but at least sort of, stop writing what they consider a blank check for the war in Ukraine, to not sort of see the benefit in supporting Ukraine's effort against Putin. You may hear some hard conversations where Republicans will surprise people in terms of their skepticism about America's foreign policy, about Biden's foreign policy, and how exactly America is going to support Ukraine going forward. So I think that's another one to watch. So yeah, look for change. Look for change and look for a Republican Party to try to find its footing after it wins the House. And as we get closer to 2024, whether or not Trump's going to announce, when the first announcements are going to happen, when are we going to get an idea of whether Biden's going to run again or not? That all remains to be seen. But as more of those events happen, I think we're going to get a clearer vision of, even though they're not announcing it maybe very clearly, what it means to be a Republican in terms of policy.
Thanks, Zach. We had a question come in privately asking why we're not hearing the Democrats message more about the January 6th insurrection. Do you think that's strategic? Do you feel like it's not playing well? Why aren't Democrats playing that up a little bit more?
No, it's a good question. I think trying to divide my own opinions from sort of what I've, sort of a more objective view of what I've observed. And I guess I would say this, that I think a lot of Democrats were watching the deliberations of the January 6th committee to basically get a sense of, will this be like the next Watergate, where we see, a national scandal playing out on national airwaves, and, will this lead to an indictment of Donald Trump? Will this lead to indictments of former Trump administration officials? Will this expose, crimes in a sort of, public and dramatic fashion? Will this help to make January 6th the kind of relevant, salient part of the agenda? And, we could talk about the merits and how successful or unsuccessful the January 6th commission or committee was. But I think on the whole, the one place that they didn't succeed is keeping this on the agenda. I think it's been overwhelmed by inflation talk. I think it's been overwhelmed by other factors like Biden's unpopularity. I think it just became too tough a putt, really, to make January 6th a kind of relevant part of the national agenda that was going to determine how people were going to vote in the midterm election. So, can we say it's because they were unsuccessful, or because January 6th isn't important, or because Americans don't care? I don't know if we can go that far, but I can say that I don't think it managed to stay on the agenda, at least not in a way that was meaningfully transforming the election in November. And last thing I'll say about that too is I think Democrats have been very cautious about trying to make this election about Donald Trump. I think they've realized that if they try to make Trump the sort of salient decision, that voters are going to tend to Republicans, or at least they're not going to listen very carefully to what the Democrats have to say. I think there's been a kind of learning curve that Democrats have been on, that they've got to run on their own positions, on their own issues, they can't make the determining factor in every race, isn't Trump terrible? I think they've had to expand beyond that. And I think there's been a concern about, if we make January 6th a centerpiece of the election, are we falling back into this trap where we're trying to make everything a referendum on Donald Trump? So I think that's kind of made candidates in the party maybe shy away from making this a salient point as well.
A nice follow-up to that question from Dale Jacobs is asking if you're concerned that if Republicans don't win control of the Senate, they will deny the vote count and consider another violent reaction.
Yeah. Well, we won't have another situation in regards to the Electoral Vote Act, because, of course, we're not electing a new president. So there won't be any counting of electoral votes. The process will work very differently. Should a vote be challenged, it would be up to the Senate in terms of deciding whether or not to seat a candidate. Is it possible that there could be, some distrust and some uncertainty and maybe some concern about this kind of outcome? I think the answer is definitely. Georgia has been a focal point of controversy driven by Donald Trump against Raffensperger, the Secretary of State, about elections and the truthfulness of elections, and are these legitimate elections? And I think in some ways, in fact, Trump managed to deflate Republicans in January during the runoff in Georgia, and probably actually helped throw the majority to Democrats in 2020. How's that going to play out in 2022? Yeah, I don't know. The state of Georgia has now changed the ways in which they operate elections. They've put more power into the hands of counties and less power into the hands of state officials in terms of the conduct of election and the counting of votes. Will that create a new scenario where there could be, more mischief to be made at the county level over results? Very possibly. I really hope not. But I do think that this is a much more likely possibility than it was 2 years ago.
We have a question coming in from Ted Gover. Ted's asking that there seems to be a lot of bipartisan consensus on the need to get tough on China in terms of securing sensitive supply chains, protecting Taiwan, and setting up for democracy. Do you see this bipartisan approach continuing if Republicans pick up either or both chambers of Congress?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There has been a lot of bipartisanship, but I do wonder, I've been reading lately that, China is talking about accelerating a timeline for a possible takeover of Taiwan, things that, might have thought unimaginable, but there's been a polarization of views, I think, on both sides, the Chinese side and the American side, on this question of the future of Taiwan, of Taiwanese defense. Will Republicans see Taiwan as necessary to American security? I don't know. I really don't know. Biden has made some very strong comments, maybe going a little past what his advisors or his Secretary of State might have advised him to do in terms of how far America would go to defend Taiwan. I don't think you would get that kind of support from Republicans. But on smaller scale issues, I think Biden actually got a real win in terms of trying to protect American technology. I think it's been a rare point of agreement and bipartisanship amongst Republicans and Democrats on foreign policy to get tougher on China and the export of important intellectual property. So, I think that's likely to continue. I think that's something that Trump, started himself in a more limited fashion, but that Biden has come out more strongly for. But on Taiwan, I wouldn't expect Republicans to back Taiwanese independence quite as strongly as certainly the president has sounded.
Richard Tebe has a follow-up to that. He says he's seen a lot of anti-China ads recently. He seems to think they're implying that Democrats are embracing China. Have you seen that, or is that?
I haven't seen that, but it doesn't surprise me. I mean, this was a tactic during the Trump administration, particularly during COVID, trying to shape COVID as being of Chinese origins, of course, but maybe even caused by China, either through accident or intention. Calling it Kung flu to basically try to make a negative association between being Chinese or being of Chinese heritage and COVID. Trying to score, I guess, some cheap political points. But we did see an uptick in violence against Asian Americans during this period of time. It's easy to prey on people's fears, and I think this is another way in which a kind of MAGA viewpoint on race and on national politics and international politics sort of feeds into people's fears and concerns. So it doesn't surprise me that Republicans may be making gestures to leverage their position on China to make Democrats look weak. But at least on a policy debate stage, like I was saying, the Biden administration has actually been stronger than the Trump administration on trying to rein in China as an international force in terms of competition on defense, in terms of competition on technology, in terms of competition on trade. Biden administration has been very strong and has had a lot of partners on the Republican side, but that's really in the realm of policy, not in the realm of politics or campaigns. So those two worlds have not been matching up very well for some time now.
I have a question about polling. There were some issues with trusting polling back in 2016. How do you feel about polling now in 2022?
Yeah, well, I think it gets harder and harder to conduct a national poll. I think national polls still, look the part in terms of the number of respondents that they get, in terms of the sample looking representative of the country. But the problem is the response rate. It's gone down markedly and it continues to go down. And there's different successful ways that polling companies can try to compensate for this. But we're not getting what we used to get, which was an actual random sample of American voters responding, particularly to telephone polling, where everyone had a phone in their wall or on their desk. They picked it up and they were likely to respond, regardless if they were a Republican or a Democrat. Now people don't pick up the phones out of fear of telemarketers or wrong numbers or what have you. They're just not as responsive. And there's started to be a bit of a bias, particularly on the Republican side, where there's a feeling that polls are being conducted by enemies, that that it's going to be biased towards the Democratic side, or it's by or for some institution they don't trust, and so they refuse to participate. There's a lot of other factors that we could talk about, but I think by and large, polling companies and the profession have managed to adjust pretty well. But we should never look to them to be, a replacement for the actual election results. They're guidelines. They're telling us what's happening about 2 weeks ago. There's factors in terms of turnout that they can't predict that can affect the final turnout. So, if a race is, plus or minus 5%, I think that's really kind of, a who knows. And depending on how a polling company is trying to manage the fact that the response rates are so low, there may be some biases as you try to break things down below the top line. If you want to say, well, what do African Americans think, or what do Hispanic voters think, or what do independents think? Those numbers can get a bit skewed too, because of the ways in which the samples are put together.
Zach, one last question. Where do you think the youth vote will land in this midterm election? Is it going to be a large turnout, a small turnout? And regardless, how is that going to sway any of the races?
Well, it's always sad, it's just a received wisdom of American politics that the youth don't vote. And that's, a kind of ongoing feature of our politics. There's been some rare instances where the American youth has become more engaged. I would say the most recent example of that was 2008 and the election of Barack Obama. We saw a surprising and unexpected uptick in youth voting, but By 2012, even though Obama ran again and won, those numbers had already dropped, that younger voters were less engaged by 2012. I think the one thing that's unusual about 2022 that could presage a higher youth turnout is Dobbs and the repeal of Roe versus Wade. Younger voters, particularly young men, are very supportive of securing abortion rights. And as this issue has become more salient, it may actually drive and give young voters a really tangible reason to turn out in 2022. And so I don't know if it's going to be a major, a minor, or a nothing, but I do think there's at least the potential for younger voters to sort of feel the pressure and feel the draw of wanting to make a change and wanting to do something about the Dobbs decision by voting in 2022. So that's what I would say.
Fantastic. Zach, thank you so much for spending an hour with us and our alumni and parent base today. Appreciate it very much. To all of you, thanks for taking your time out of your busy schedules and joining CMC for one of our virtual programs. A big thank you also for those of you that supported the 1946 challenge last week. It was incredibly successful, and we appreciate all of your continued support. Hope to see you at future on and off campus programming and, of course, virtual programming. As I mentioned, November 3 is an Australian wine tasting. Registrations are due this Sunday. Hope to see you either at one of our LA, Seattle, or San Diego activities coming up in the next few weeks. Feel free to unmute, say hello, say goodbye. Have a great night, everybody.
Yeah, thanks everyone for your attention. Really appreciated you coming out.